My name is Karen Smith Ratabi Casares, and today I will be talking about the children that were separated from their parents on the US border underneath the Trump administration. Um, it's really important to acknowledge that this documentation has been pretty wide in both the press as well as academic literature. I specifically was a part of publishing the forced child family separations in the southwestern US border under the zero tolerance policy, the adverse impact on well-being of migrant children. So this particular article is the one I'll be referring to most today. And while we'll be talking about adverse impact briefly, really what's going to be the main thrust of the presentation is the facts of the matter, what occurred underneath the Trump administration, and then the human rights framing as we think about the problems on the border and what occurred there so that we can try to prevent that in the future. So just so you know, my framing of the problems at hand are really related to how I view the rights of immigration. And it's impossible to talk about that without thinking about my grandmother and my family's immigration to the United States. So you saw the green card there, and that was my grandmother's green card. My family started to immigrate when I had my great grandmother came as a pretty young person, and then my grandmother. So our family has been in the United States for over 100 years. So we were very early immigrants to the United States from Mexico. So you have what my family experienced on the border was pretty free movement of people. And then my grandmother eventually received a green card, as you saw. But today, there is no free movement of people from Latin America into the United States. It's a pretty structured immigration system, although we do know many people have come into the country undocumented. So here we have a photograph of a little girl, obviously being traumatized as her mother, and they're from Honduras, as her mother's being questioned as she's making entry with her daughter into the United States. This was when the Time magazine titled this "Welcome to America." Very, very different experience from my family. And it's really shows the trauma and the absolute terror that these children are experiencing on the border. What we do know about this little girl, as of the last time I was making some inquiry, she was not separated from her mother, but we're not sure exactly as to her well-being or whereabouts. And so there's a really kind of this imposing government structure over family life, as you can see in the front page of Time magazine. So just so you know, the terminology detention is important, and the families entering the United States without authorization, quite often called illegal, right? This is that terminology about legal versus illegal. The undocumented people were separated by the Department of Homeland Security. Then in most cases, the adults were held in federal detention while their children were transferred to the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement within the Department of Health and Human Services. Frequently, their cases were treated as unaccompanied minors. Now, be clear, these are the children who were coming in with their parents, and then they would become classified as unaccompanied minors as they were removed from their parents. This is underneath the Trump administration. So just to frame this up a little bit more, imprisoning people of color is a major issue. We know that from the Black Lives Matter movement, but also we have the US history of imprisonment. And we know that Japanese were interned during the Second World War, and that affected 120,000 people of Japanese descent, 62% of whom were US citizens. And that was ordered by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who has been considered generally a progressive, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was even integrally involved with the Declaration on Human Rights. So just to frame this up, important to know our history of imprisonment of people of color and separating families and putting them behind chain link fences, as you saw in that last slide. So underneath the zero tolerance policy, which was a Trump administration policy, we found that on April 6, 2018, the US Attorney General, that was Jeff Sessions, announced a zero tolerance policy. And that was aimed at affirming the criminalization of illegal entry into the United States. This is crossing without being at the official border crossing and moving through the system with paperwork. Sessions directed the U.S. Attorney's offices in the Southern Districts of California, New Mexico, and Texas to adopt a policy to prosecute all Department of Homeland Security referrals of Section 1325A violations for actual and attempted illegal entries at the U.S. border. So again, this is entering the U.S. at an unauthorized time and place, which would become a misdemeanor crime. And this issue of crime is important. So let's talk a little bit really quickly, again, to frame. This is where you start seeing the imprisonment of people, which is a part of that larger issue that we have around the prison industrial complex in the United States, where just thousands upon thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people have been put into various prisons around the country, including people who are undocumented in terms of their crimes being related to immigration. So detentions. So we have a deterrent strategy that is being used, and the term deterrent was very clearly used by the Trump administration. The U.S. Attorney General, again, Jeff Sessions, openly admitted that that policy, the zero tolerance policy, enforced separations on the border was meant to send a message to stay away or risk parent-child separation. Now, this was being reported openly in the news. And other outrageous comments were made by Vice President Mike Pence and President Trump that are counter to internationally agreed rights to seek safety in another country. That would be asylum seeking. And we do know that a number of these families were coming into the United States with the intent to seek asylum based on protections of special social groups or political persecution, fears around violence related to gang violence and other kinds of problems that were happening in Central America. So there were clear abuses of power. Among the abuses, reportedly in an unknown number of cases, the immigration agents hastily administered documents that were essentially child relinquishment paperwork written in English. Now, this wasn't in every case, but there was some documentation of these kinds of documents written in English in which some detained parents were required to sign over their parental rights under duress. Now, this is completely counter to good child protection or child welfare practice. As social workers, we'd never tolerate such a step to separate children legally from their parents. And we do know from credible press reports, there were an unknown number of immigrants were essentially forced to sign their children into custody of the US government without any rights to their children's return or unification. And that is, being forced into this scenario without any protection from a lawyer or any kind of legal framework to stop this from occurring. So just so we know really quickly, I've already mentioned Central America. We know that the vast majority of immigrants that were affected by this policy were actually from the Northern Triangle, that is Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Now, Guatemala in particular, as well as El Salvador, have a history of civil war. All three countries have a history of narco trafficking, and there are major issues around climate change related to drought, malnutrition, and hunger. These countries are called the Northern Triangle, and they are highly problematic as we think about the kinds of conditions that are happening related to immigrants seeking an opportunity to come into the United States. Many people from the region are eligible for an asylum claim, fear of persecution, including fleeing violence against women, both familial and societal, women as being a protected social group, fleeing gender and identity-based violence, individuals identifying as transgendered, for instance, or just LGBTQ, and then fleeing gang violence. There is an environmental of impunity there, that is lawlessness, and the collapse of civil society is an ongoing concern related to the Northern Triangle. This is post-conflict, those wars being long over. The social fabric of these countries are stretched beyond limits, and there are just serious social problems occurring that really leaves thousands upon thousands of people immigrating north to a life in the United States to really flee violence. So immediately under the zero tolerance policy, the ACLU challenged the Trump administration over the separation of migrant parents and their children. And there are court cases which occurred at that time period. And this is my second fact as I look at the facts of the matter. So on the 26th of June, 2018, California's federal court was very effective at first, putting a stop um, in terms of making it a legal order, quickly moved into action to prohibit family separations and ordered the federal government to reunify separated families who met certain criteria. It clearly stated the expectation of 30 days to reunite. Now, there's where you had the problem. The reunification efforts, which is an area of social work expertise, were not very effective. We'll look at that more closely. So on the 20th of June 2018, Trump signed an executive order ending the zero tolerance policy without guidance for the reunification of children and families affected. So the order was signed, however, there was no guidance for the reunification process. And of course, as social workers, we were alarmed because we recognized that this was an area of case management that was going to require skilled attention and considerable resources to make reunification with these families, many of whom were already going back to Central America without their children. The problem persisted in new forms related to parents being deemed dangerous due to their legal history. So sometimes simple traffic violations or other minor offenses were used as excuses for parent-child separation. And this is really a distortion of the best interest of the child principle. In child welfare, we talk about what is in the best interest of children in terms of making major decisions about that child's well-being. And we recognize that removing children from their families based on minor legal offenses is really not in the best interest of a child. So there were children that were experiencing this too, this phenomena of removal due to legal problems. So in fact number 5, in the summer of 2008, we started to try to figure out exactly how many children were affected, and there was a lack of transparency at the Trump administration. And there were reports of approximately 2,500 children were reportedly affected. And then by August 16th of 2018, the ACLU reported that 565 children remained in custody of the government, and 366 of them, ages 6 and 5 years old, or under 5 years old, had their parents deported to their home country. So this is really complicated and obviously a violation of human rights. The judge in California said that this was unacceptable, and there were a whole variety of organizations coming to the defense of these children. These are human rights defenders. That's an important term for us as social work. Human rights defenders coming to the defense of these children to search for the deported parents. There was limited success early on in that search. We'll look at that as related now to the current presidential administration, the Biden administration, which has moved into gear to respond to this issue of reunification, but really quickly make it clear that there was a lack of transparency because, as you will see as we move forward, more children than 2,500 were separated. So again, how many were actually affected? So we do know that far more than 2,500 were affected, and the one example of children that were not counted in this number was a 2017 operation in El Paso, Texas, in which there's a secret piloting of this initiative that resulted in increased family separations related to prosecution initiative. This was a foreshadow of the zero tolerance policy. And we know from that, what we can determine is 283 parents were prosecuted, but numbers of children affected were not reported. So these were early piloting phases of what became the zero tolerance policy. And today we know more than 3,900 children were separated from their parents as per estimates by the Biden administration. This is 3,900 children, not just in El Paso, but the zero tolerance policy in general. These are the children the Biden administration recognized needed to be addressed in terms of any children that were not reunified by the time Biden came into office. He set forth a task force to make sure those children were reunited. So this lack of government transparency during the Trump administration is critical for us to acknowledge, because a free and democratic society operates in a manner that is transparent, especially related to human rights. That was clearly absent during the Trump administration as related to the zero tolerance policy. So beds for kids were needed during the zero tolerance policy. And one thing that was quite alarming was adoption agencies becoming involved in taking these children in underneath foster care contracts. And some children were transported thousands of miles from the border and their parents that were being detained on the border to locations around the country so the children would have beds in these foster homes that were rapidly set up. For example, Bethany Christian Family Services in Michigan was one group. Lutheran Family Services in South Carolina was another group. And as the press began to report the facts of the matter, the cost per day in terms of what these organizations were paid was $700 a day to take care of these children. This was a new form of the prison industrial complex in terms of taking care of minors that were forcibly separated from their families on the border. So there were lots of press stories that were occurring, and one important one was by Catherine Joyce, that wrote the book The Child Catchers. And this is a piece in The Intercept that it was titled The Threat of International Adoption for Migrant Children Separated from Their Families. So one of the really critical things that started happening was, are these children going to be adopted? That was a big question. And the reality is it was a really important question, because stopping the children from being placed in adopted families became a real call for a social justice and human rights initiative, because severing legal ties permanently is an absolute violation of human rights. We'll look at that more closely as we move along. So under the Trump administration, there are some facts that were really constantly changing and were confusing to the public. It really felt as if the confusion was part of the process in terms of sending out messaging around that idea of deterrent strategy, also confusing the American public about who these people really were. There was a lot of kind of name calling around criminals. President Trump talked about the people coming across the border as being rapists and other kinds of criminals. And there's this whole element of really sending messages that were very demeaning and creating the other, really pointing a finger at people who were just trying to seek a life, frequently trying to save their lives by coming to the United States. So when it was first reported that there were 27 children affected by the zero tolerance policy, and then they remained in government custody, again, really poor reporting of the number of children. And however, at least 1,000 children were also taken in custody based on their parents being identified as a threat due to criminal offense, such as small traffic violations. That was mentioned earlier, and this is important to recognize that we do not tolerate, as social workers, minor offenses being related to separating children in the child welfare system, our foster care and adoption system. However, this standard has not applied at this era to children that parents were coming in from Central America and Mexico. So the Biden administration now reports a set of facts that are more clear, and they're different facts to some degree. As of June 7th, 2021, 60 children were still separated from their families of this large group of 3,900 children that were separated, and active reunification efforts continue to be underway. So let's talk about one of the policy frameworks that overlay this problem that occurred. And during the Trump administration, there was a rolling back of the Flores Agreement, which detaining children indefinite with their families is a violation of that agreement. The agreement stated that 21 days of maximum detention in the least restrictive environment was important, and that was being ignored as an obligation with the administrative policy and procedure underneath the Trump administration. This agreement dates back to 1993. It's not clear right now as to how that Flores Agreement is being honored in any way, shape, or form, but we do know that putting people and children in detention for more than 21 days on a minor criminal offense, if you should even agree that this is a criminal offense, is really more than problematic for the children. It's a dire, grave human rights abuse. And for the families, the parents, again, a human rights abuse. And you saw in the press kinds of demonstrations that occurred outside of these facilities, including this one placard, "What kind of monsters put children in cages?" So the sense of putting children in cages became absolute discourse in amongst American people about, do we care about these non-citizen children? Do we care about these families? And it was a part of that discourse that's ongoing around immigration rights in the United States. So now let's look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This dates back towards the end of 1940s, after the Second World War, 1948 being critical year of passage. And very importantly for you to understand as social workers, that human dignity was defined as a concept underneath this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that aligns with social work's dignity and the worth of person system, value system, as per our National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics. So there's a relevant article, the right to seek safety in another country, asylum seeking, but also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have the right to form a family, we have special protections for mothers, and we have special protections for childhood. Also, you'll find for this protection for mothers, that's further elaborated on a later convention on the elimination of discrimination against women, and which there has protections for motherhood. Also, those protections for children or childhood are found in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, another United Nations convention there. We'll look at that as we consider children's rights. So this UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most agreed upon convention globally. There is little disagreement about this convention. Notably, Somalia was one country that had not signed the convention, and now that has now been solved. Somalia has now signed that convention in their post-conflict environment, and now today the United States is the most notable, that has continued to seize the opportunity to sign this convention. And there's many reasons for that, which I will not go into, but you need to know that the United States has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, otherwise the most universally agreed upon convention in the world. So let's look at some of the articles related to the rights of children. And an article is, you might just think of that as a standard, but we call them articles in human rights terms. And the right to be cared for by one's own parents whenever possible, that's Article 7. The right not to be separated from parents against one's will. And we need to make decisions by a competent authority in the child's best interest when there is any separation, and that's Article 9. We have the right to be protected against international trafficking, that's child trafficking. And we won't go into this, but some child trafficking concerns can intersect with this problem of children coming across the border. The right for children to receive care that pays due regard to cultural background, that's Article 20. So when children were placed in foster families that were not speaking Spanish, for instance, that is really a problem when it comes to cultural and linguistic background. The right not to be adopted in a way that violates the laws of home countries. Again, I've already mentioned adoption as a deep, serious concern. Notably, it does not appear that large numbers of children entered into adoption, but that has not been transparent either. And then the right not to be adopted internationally when there's suitable care for them available in their own country. So these are important United Nations Convention on the Rights of Child articles that can be overlaid on this problem of children being separated from their families on the border. So remember, the Trump administration had several thousand children that they actually had no accounting for, and they admitted to losing prior to the zero tolerance policy. So one of the absolute outrages was, how are we going to make sure that we don't lose more children that are caught in this system? They have not been effective at documenting children who have been for lack of better words, misplaced. They didn't know where the children were, what foster families they went to, or if they were released to their families that were already in the United States. They didn't know where these children actually were. They couldn't track them down. So several thousand children. So when more children were being removed from their families, was there adequate documentation of who these children were and who they were attached to, who their biological families were? This was a main concern above and beyond the initial trauma of separating children, was what kind of record keeping was being kept by an organization who had done a very poor job thus far. And even more children than originally thought separated during that secret piloting of the process in El Paso had begun, and we didn't know what had occurred to those children either. So the Trump administration was literally losing children in the system. So I've done some work with human rights defenders in Central America, specifically really oriented to Guatemala, where I've done a lot of research and been involved with children abduction and some of the other problems that are occurring for family life in Guatemala. And I've worked with an internationally renowned human rights defender who was actually nominated for a Nobel Prize. And I'm proud to call Norma Cruz my friend and colleague. And Norma explained to me, as well as in making public kind of declarations and her positioning on children being abducted from their families, was that in this very traditional family life of Guatemala, but elsewhere also, that the women in particular, but the families have a sense of eternal suffering when they don't know what happened to their children and they're not reunited. And just, I provide these pictures with you. These are photographs that I took in Central America, specifically in Guatemala, that really are reminders that, do we know much about these mothers in particular? Who are these women who've lost their family's life and lost their children into this system? We know very little. There's very little research that's been done on the Northern Triangle side of this equation. And I just want to remind everyone that we always need to consider the human rights of groups of people who are under research that we don't know enough about. We don't know the identities of people. And I mean identity beyond paperwork, the identities of being indigenous, in which it's been estimated as much as 50% of Guatemala's population identifies as indigenous. So these are people who, as First Nations people, also should be afforded some special protections as indigenous people. So I just bring the eternal suffering up because we want to make sure that people understand the depth of pain. And then we have the human rights defense organizations such as the ACLU. These are the organizations that really came in quick response. The Southern Poverty Law Center was also important in responding to the separations on the border. From a social work perspective, International Social Services, which is based in Switzerland, but then has offices around the world, including here in the United States, they are really case management experts, and they became involved. We also had a whole array of lawyers and paralegals that were trying to process cases and look at defending people and their rights. And we had other people working on the border in various capacities. For example, down in the San Diego, Tijuana area, there were the Border Angels. They were literally leaving cartons of water out on the desert to help people make a safe passage in terms of the dying literally of thirsting to death while people are passing through the border areas. This is again coming in across these borders in a way that's considered illegal and coming in passage through areas that are not maintained by our border security in terms of processing paperwork. So legal migration and the self-return of Mexicans is occurring. So I think this is important for us to acknowledge, especially those of us who live in California, that many Mexicans in particular have decided to make some choices around self-return, as well as literally coming in fewer numbers. So there's really a misunderstanding of the facts of the case, that most of these cases we're talking about are actually Northern Triangle cases rather than Mexico. And it's really important for us to recognize that the undocumented population has decreased to 2.3 million, down since 21% down since 2010. And New York had a 25% decrease in the same time period. So think about California and New York being major destination locations for Mexicans in particular. And even at the arrival of the border, a large number of peoples from the Northern Triangle, particularly families fleeing violence, and a larger portion of undocumented people have arrived in recent years on travel visas. Another fact, that many of the people who come into the United States undocumented actually come on travel visas, and they overstay. And so we had the politics of what's being reported, the facts of the matter, and then we had the politics underneath the Trump administration of the wall, putting up a border wall to stop people from coming in, when in fact we know that many of the people were actually coming in on travel visas via airlines. So that's another area of correcting the misinformation that was occurring during this time period and continues to occur to this day, as we have these discourses around rights of immigration. So I just want to point out that we're really in a time in which there's a lot of migration. People are on the move around the world. This is a picture in Syria, and it's a press story from the Associated Press in 2020. And it shows how children are freezing to death. Bombs are raining down, and it feels like nobody cares, and the sky has no borders. Think about this as we talk about the Afghanis who are seeking refuge are all around the world, with the United States military operations airlifting out thousands upon thousands of Afghanis that are seeking asylum frequently, right? Because they fit into certain political persecution or social groups. So think about the importance of what we've learned about immigration and the rights to seek asylum underneath the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and how this affects many people beyond those from the Northern Triangle, and how families will be processed, and keeping their families intact without removing children is critically important. I know the Biden administration is far more committed than ever because of the violations which occurred in the Trump administration, which really shined the light upon administrative policy and procedure and how we handle those coming to the United States underneath duress. So also, to be really clear, we still have many what you might call prisons, right? The prison industrial complex for unaccompanied children. And just in 2019, the US opened a new mass facility in Texas for migrant children. This is really kind of an invisible reality frequently for most Americans, a lack of understanding about the amount of places in which we are detaining people while immigration processing occurs, detaining people for long periods of time, people that are being deported, staying in these deportation kinds of lockdowns, and even knowing where someone is and where they're being kept. Their families in the United States frequently can't even track down their family member because the rights of people who are not citizens that are being detained, the idea that you have one right to a phone call, these kinds of ideas that we have are not being guaranteed rights to people who are not citizens. So very complicated in the prison industrial complex. So really quickly, I'm just going to touch upon this, that the ACEs that were a part of this article stands for the adverse childhood experiences. And these experiences can include things like physical and emotional abuse, neglect, caregiver mental illness, and related erratic behaviors, as well as household violence. Obviously, separation of children from their parents on the border is a traumatic experience, as we saw in that first photograph of the little girl from Honduras, clearly experiencing trauma as she stands by her mother while the border guard is interrogating her mother. So children who go back to Mexico and Central America, many of the children have been going back as they've been reunited by their families, as the families have been linked with, and we make those reintegration efforts. They're going back to Mexico and Central America, mainly Central America, with ACEs needs. And that's not to be underestimated. So as social workers, and we think about our commitment to prevention, we recognize that in order to support the well-being of children and families, that the ACEs framework identifies discouraging conditions that children may experience so that prevention strategies can work to reduce the likelihood of their reoccurrence and mitigate their effects. I want you to think about prevention efforts as we deal with immigration. How do we prevent ACEs? Especially, we will continue to have unaccompanied children coming into the United States. That is a whole another category of children. These are frequently teenagers, et cetera, but some of them are quite young, coming into the United States and the traumas that they've experienced. And we really take ACEs quite seriously as social workers, as we must be prepared to address these traumas when working with children as well as adults who have unresolved trauma. And so we're really, as being really committed to preventing trauma, we need to be advocating for immigration policies and administrative policies and procedures which are really sensitive to these needs. So I have some selective references here. I encourage you to Google in the news stories. There's a whole array of information as well as evolving information about new stages of the immigration crisis on the border and how the Biden administration is trying to resolve these problems in a manner that is fair and consistent with human rights while still having many challenges on the border. This is far from perfect. The level of imperfect is still highly concerning for us as social workers. Thank you.